Hello, I'm Link, and I have a lot of friends who like the idea of trying out photography but don't understand how to use a camera or are too scared to get into the subject as a whole. I'm making this video to educate you on the basics so you can feel more confident in your knowledge on the subject while learning how to use a camera in the process. So when you see a camera, it can be confusing because of all the options and buttons. Most of it is useless features geared to seem like more advanced technology is a selling point for camera companies. I personally don't use a lot of these features. There are really only 3 things you have to understand about your camera in order to translate your mental image into a well-balanced photograph. These being aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. The first thing to note is that these are all sliders on your camera. What I mean by this is that they have a value that increases or decreases. As one of these 3 factors increase or decrease, the lighting of the photo changes. You don't need to memorize this, but just for example's sake, as the aperture value increases, the image becomes darker, and as the shutter speed increases and the ISO increases, the image becomes brighter. When you're taking a photo, you want to be able to switch settings on your camera fast so you never miss a shot, so it's important to know these sliders by heart. At first I tried classic memorization, but that wasn't helpful. Knowing what these settings do to change your camera is much easier to remember and also lets you understand the science behind taking a photo. Your camera is essentially a piece of glass that lets in light leading to a sensor. The sensor translates the light into a photo. A plastic curtain comes down in front of the glass, letting in a certain amount of light between each photo. This curtain is called the shutter. There is also a second curtain type that determines how much of the glass is exposed, essentially how wide the diameter of glass exposure is. This is to control how much light is taken in on the surface of the glass. This is called aperture. With that basic understanding, we can go into the values of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. As mentioned before, shutter speed is a curtain. The sensor that creates the photo can receive light between long periods of time, like at the left. This can be at minutes, hours, days at a time, or smaller periods like the ones at the right with thousandths of a second or even less. So the speed at which the shutter closes, signaling for the sensor to stop receiving light, is the shutter speed. For longer periods of time, the shutter takes longer to close and the sensor takes in more light because of the extended duration. This will make the photo much brighter. If the shutter speed is very small, the sensor has much less time to take in light, and the photo will be much darker. So as the shutter speed increases and is longer, the image becomes brighter, and as the shutter speed decreases and is faster, the image becomes darker. This can become confusing when looking at the numbers that represent this value simply because it is a fraction. So long periods of time like half a second are represented by 1/2, while faster speeds like a thousandth of a second are represented by 1/1000. And as the denominator value decreases, the fraction as a whole increases. So when you say the shutter speed value increases, that would look like the change from 1/200 to 1/100. Next is aperture. This is the second curtain. The distinction between these 2 curtains is the shutter speed determines the amount of light that comes in by defining a time period of light intake, while the aperture curtain determines the physical area of light being taken in. As you can imagine, the wider the opening, the more light that's taken in. Sadly, the people that determined the value to represent aperture decided to make it harder to remember. The physical quantity is the distance from the edge of the piece of the glass to the edge of the curtain. So a smaller number means a wider opening. So as the aperture becomes wider, the actual value decreases and the light intake increases. As the curtain takes up more area, like with f of 16, its value increases, meaning the glass surface exposed is decreased and light intake is decreased. For vocabulary's sake, people call aperture f-stop. That's important for the next couple examples. A small value for aperture is 2.8, f-stop 2.8. The distance between the glass and the curtain is small, so the surface area of the glass is high and light intake is very high. F-stop 16, however, is a very big number, indicating a lot of curtain space and less light being taken in. Now you know that shutter speed is the duration of time that light is taken in, and aperture is the physical area of light taken in. You know shutter speed increases with the decreasing volume of light, and aperture or f-stop increases with the decreasing of light. due to the value being the physical quantity of curtain area. However, both of these settings have their own specific effect on the image beyond just how bright the image is. With shutter speed, the longer you let light in, the more detailed the image is going to be. However, the longer periods of time means the sensor has to merge more light together. For things that are stagnant, the image becomes much clearer because the camera is merging a barrage of light data all extremely similar to each other, so it picks up on more details. However, if things move or the camera isn't steady enough, the merge makes things blurry, trying to stitch together the discrepancies between the light that was taken in. This is not always a bad thing. In some landscape photos, people like the flowy water effect. This is accomplished by letting the camera stitch the photos between a longer period of time, making the water merge into a flowy texture. You can see this with these larger fraction on the right side. It is a longer duration of time indicated. The opposite end of this scale can be seen in the National Geographic photo shoots with animals. They try to capture a specific moment of action, so they need a very small shutter speed to ensure they don't miss their moment. That's because with a fast shutter speed, you are able to take many photos more than whenever you have a longer shutter speed. So if you want a detailed photo, you need a longer shutter speed, meaning a longer period of time. If you want to take a lot of photos in a short period of time, you need a smaller or shorter shutter speed. The special aspect of aperture is the field of focus. I won't get into the science of it because the specifics of the science elude me, but as the curtain size is smaller, like f-stop 2.8, the field of view is smaller. As the curtain size is larger, the field of view is also larger. So the field of view is how much of the photo is in detail. You can see with an f-stop of 2.8, the field of view is smaller because less of it's in detail, and with the f-stop 16, more of the photo is in focus because there's a larger field of view. This is much more stylistic than the shutter speed because it relies more on the artist's taste rather than the reason for taking the photo, which is detail versus speed. However, something I've seen is that portraits are typically taken with smaller apertures, while landscapes are taken with higher apertures. This is because the portraits have a main focus. The subject is the purpose of the piece, so they are the only thing in true detail. With landscapes, however, the entire photo is in detail because it is about the sum of the parts, so all the parts need to be in focus. The last value is ISO. I mentioned this last because it is debatably the easiest and last setting you choose. The ISO is a post-processing change. This is a fancy way of saying it's applied after the photo is taken. Shutter speed and aperture determine the amount of light before and during the photo taking process, while ISO is applied after the photo is already taken. This makes it easier to remember because there's no physical value like the duration per thousandths of a second or the millimeter of curtain space of light taken in. Simply put, as ISO is increased, the brightness of the photo is increased. As ISO is decreased, the brightness of the photo is also decreased. How do these things come together? If you need to rewatch the first part to have the basic 3 down, please do so because this is where things become a little trickier to understand. If not, hopefully you've noticed that these 3 values contribute to how bright your photo is in the end. But why is brightness so important? Why not just make one value really bright and leave the others darker so that the photo comes out in the middle? Well, as mentioned before, if you do that to shutter speed, it might make your photos blurrier if your hand isn't steady enough or if something is moving. With aperture, you don't get as much of your photo in focus, which is an issue if it doesn't match the style of photo you are trying to take. This is where ISO comes in. I determine my aperture or shutter speed first based on the style versus the purpose of the photo respectively, and then use my ISO as the equalizer. If the style is more important than the purpose, like taking a portrait or landscape, the aperture should be prioritized and set first. If the purpose is more important, the shutter speed should be set first, like action shots versus details. After setting either aperture or shutter speed, set the remaining one to a point where you have a desired FOV or fast enough shutter speed to have a non-blurry photo. Then, depending on how your photo turns out, set the ISO. To clarify, when I say fast enough shutter speed to have a non-blurry photo, I'm referencing the fact that most people can only stay still enough for a clear photo at 1/120 and pro photographers at 1/60 shutter speed. Anything slower and you need a tripod or something to mount it on because our hands as humans cannot stay still enough in order to avoid making a blurry photo because our shutter speed is too long. If I want to take a portrait, for example, I choose a low aperture so the focus is only on the subject. That is the style of the photo. This low aperture means a lot of light is coming in because the aperture curtain is smaller. This means I need to adjust my shutter speed to be a little faster so that the photo isn't blown out or too bright. You might ask why change the shutter speed at all and just compensate for the lighting change with ISO. The issue with relying on ISO too much is that it is an artificial increase of light. It creates a very noisy photo as it increased, especially if it's relied on too much. This is why we use it to adjust the settings after aperture and shutter speed are chosen and set, rather than rely on it to determine those lighting settings. With a portrait, the aperture comes first, but what if we had an action shot? The purpose is to capture a moment in time rather than stylize the photo, so shutter speed comes first. We want a really fast shutter speed, something like 1/2000th of a second. This means we have to sacrifice a lot of aperture to make sure our photo isn't too dark. This means just our subject and a little of the surrounding area will be in focus. With portraits, you can take as many photos as needed to tweak the settings, but it's important to take pictures before the desired action happens for action photography types. This way, if your photo is a little too dark, you can adjust the ISO or other settings accordingly. If you notice the focus is blurry, you might need to turn down your shutter speed even more and sacrifice even more aperture and ISO. This way, if the photo is a little too dark, you can adjust the ISO. If you notice the focus is blurry, you might need to turn down your shutter speed even more and sacrifice even more aperture and maybe some more ISO. If you cannot get enough light in your photo, meaning you're sitting at a slow shutter speed like 1/20th, our human capabilities, and a low aperture like 2.8, that's usually where modern cameras stop, you have to compensate with a high ISO. However, this isn't ideal, especially if you need to have a faster shutter speed or high aperture because of your first priority, which is the purpose versus style, potentially making your photo even darker. In this case, you have to weigh the options. Would you rather give up your style and purpose of the photo a little or have a grainy photo? If the ISO is absolutely unbearable, there are some noise reduction post-processing effects you can apply to the photo. Though hard, you might also try to artificially illuminate the setting even more, like with studio lights, or find a brighter location. All this time, I've been talking about increasing light and haven't talked much about how to decrease light. This is mostly because it will most likely be more challenging to go up in brightness than down because of the light needed to create a photo. For decreasing the lighting, you want to do the process in reverse, starting with decreasing the ISO. The lower your ISO, the better, because the less noise your photo will have. Usually, ISO sits at a decent number like 500 just because it can be hard to balance shutter speed and aperture sometimes with your desired purpose and stylization. This value is high enough to when you drop it to its lowest value, like usually it's, or I think it's always 100, it is nearly assured that the photo is going to be dark enough. If even at 100 it is still too bright, then you would have to go to your secondary priority option, which we know is determined by whether we care more about the style or the purpose of the given shot, so determining whether we would turn down aperture or shutter speed. Next. With all this said, all you need to absolutely know and take away from this video is the basics of how the camera functions, knowing that the shutter speed is a curtain that determines the period of time light is taken in, and aperture determines the quantity of light coming in on the surface. Shutter speed also affects the detail of the photo, while aperture affects the FOV. ISO should always be set last, and if relied on too much to brighten a photo, it will make the photo grainy. Lastly, unless you have a tripod, never go slower than 120 for shutter speed. That is the end of this video. I recommend rewatching if some things are still a little unclear. The information is pretty much all there. It is just so much to absorb, it can be hard to get in one go. Thanks for watching, and I hope this helps.
Hi, we are your IFA co-founders. I'm Ellie.
And I'm Miriam.
And thank you so much for watching our videos.
You guys can learn more about our cause down below at our website, www.inspirationfinearts.org.
And if you like this video, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel.
We couldn't be where we are without the support of you guys, so make sure to send in videos of the things that you've learned during classes and pictures of the art that you completed.
Everything you send in will be featured on all our social media platforms.
Thanks for supporting us, and until next time,
Go find your inspiration.